I never thought I'd be reading my sister's diary. Sophie always guarded that purple leather journal like it held state secrets, clutching it to her chest whenever I walked into our shared room. But 3 weeks after her accident, when the doctors said she might not wake up, I found myself sitting on her unmade bed, rain pattering against our childhood bedroom window, holding the key she'd hidden behind her dresser mirror. What I discovered inside those pages didn't just break my heart, it shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, about Sophie, and about the person I'd spent 27 years believing I was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain in Portland had been relentless that Thursday morning, drumming against the windows of our old Craftsman house on Riverside Drive like impatient fingers. I'd taken another day off work to help Mom and Dad manage the endless stream of hospital visits, insurance calls, and the strange limbo that follows when someone you love hovers between consciousness and silence. Sophie had been in the ICU at St. Mary's for 3 weeks now, her Honda Civic wrapped around an oak tree on Highway 26 during what should have been a routine drive back from the University of Oregon. The house felt hollow without her laughter echoing from the kitchen or her terrible indie music bleeding through the thin walls upstairs. Mom spent most days at the hospital, Dad buried himself in paperwork at Chen's garden supply, and I found myself gravitating towards Sophie's half of our old bedroom, as if being surrounded by her chaos might somehow pull her back to us. Her side had always been an explosion of color, concert posters taped haphazardly to the pale yellow walls, fairy lights strung around her twin bed frame, textbooks scattered across a desk that hadn't seen organization since high school. I wasn't snooping, not initially. Mom had asked me to pack some of Sophie's things for when she woke up, comfortable clothes, her favorite lavender pillow spray, that ridiculous stuffed elephant she'd had since childhood. But as I folded her oversized sweaters and gathered the books scattered across her nightstand, I kept thinking about how little I actually knew about my sister's life at college. We texted sporadically, shared memes on Instagram, but the deep conversations we'd had as kids had faded somewhere between her graduation and my move to the Pearl District. That's when I noticed the loose floorboard near her desk chair. Sophie had always been terrible at hiding things: her Halloween candy, report cards she didn't want Mom to see, the $20 she'd stolen from Dad's wallet in 8th grade. The floorboard creaked differently than the others, and when I pressed it with my toe, it lifted slightly at one corner. Underneath, wrapped in an old pillowcase, was the purple leather journal I'd seen her writing in countless times over the years. The small brass key taped to the back of her dresser mirror seemed to wink at me in the gray afternoon light. Sophie had never been subtle about her hiding spots, and part of me wondered if she'd wanted them to be found. I held the diary in my hands for several minutes, feeling the weight of violated trust pressing against my chest. But Sophie couldn't tell me what was happening in her mind, couldn't explain why she'd been driving alone in that storm when she usually carpooled with friends, couldn't answer the questions that had been eating at our family for weeks. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, sophomore year of college, written in Sophie's distinctive looping handwriting with purple ink. Maya came to visit today and everyone at Delta Phi kept talking about how lucky I am to have such a successful older sister. If they only knew that Maya's success feels like a shadow I'll never step out of. Mom and Dad light up when they talk about her marketing job, her apartment, her perfect life. When they talk about me, it's always potential, what I might become, what I could achieve if I just applied myself like Maya does. My stomach dropped. I'd visited Sophie that weekend, met her sorority sisters, helped her move into her new dorm. She'd seemed so happy, so vibrant, introducing me around campus like I was some kind of celebrity. I had no idea she felt diminished by my presence. I kept reading, turning pages that revealed a version of our family dynamic I'd never seen from the other side. Maya's engagement party is next month, and I can already picture how it's going to go. Everyone will coo over her ring, ask about wedding plans, tell Mom and Dad how proud they must be. I'll smile and play the supportive little sister, but inside I'll be screaming because once again, I'm just the warm-up act for Maya's main event. Sometimes I think they only had me so Maya would have someone to mentor, someone to make her look even more accomplished by comparison. The engagement party. I remembered that night differently, how proud I'd felt when Sophie gave that sweet toast about watching me find my person, how she'd helped me pick out the perfect dress, how she'd stayed late to help clean up. But reading her words, I could suddenly see the performance in it, the careful way she'd positioned herself just outside the spotlight while making sure I shined. Page after page revealed the careful choreography of our relationship from her perspective. Every achievement I'd celebrated, every milestone our parents had commemorated, had been a reminder to Sophie of what she wasn't measuring up to. When I got promoted to senior marketing coordinator, she wrote about feeling like she'd disappoint everyone if she changed her major from business to art therapy. When I bought my loft in the Pearl District, she wrote about how embarrassing it would be to move back home after graduation while I was building this impressive adult life. The worst part isn't that Maya is perfect, one entry read, it's that she's genuinely kind about it. She never rubs it in my face, never makes me feel small on purpose. She probably has no idea that every time she offers to help with my resume, or gives me career advice, it feels like she's patting a puppy on the head. Like I'm this cute little project she's watching stumble through life. I had to stop reading. The rain had intensified, and the room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were pressing closer with each revelation. This wasn't the sister I knew, the confident, free-spirited Sophie who seemed to float through life unburdened by the anxieties that plagued me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This was someone who'd been drowning quietly while I assumed she was swimming. But there was more. The entries from her junior year took a darker turn, revealing struggles I'd been completely blind to. Maya keeps asking why I haven't brought anyone home for dinner lately, why I'm not dating. How do I tell her that I've been seeing Dr. Williams for anxiety and depression since sophomore year? How do I explain that the medication makes me feel flat, that some days getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain? She'd want to help, want to fix it, and I can't be another one of Maya's projects. Dr. Williams. I recognized the name. She was a therapist who specialized in working with college students. Sophie had been in therapy for almost 2 years, struggling with mental health issues I'd never suspected. While I'd been sending her funny texts and assuming her quieter moments were just typical college stress, she'd been fighting battles I couldn't even imagine. The most recent entries, written just weeks before the accident, painted a picture of someone who felt completely lost. I'm about to graduate, and I have no idea who I'm supposed to be outside of Maya's little sister. Everyone expects me to follow her path, get a corporate job, find a nice apartment, settle down with someone stable. But what if I want to travel? What if I want to teach art to kids who've been through trauma? What if I don't want the life everyone thinks I should want? Maya made all her choices look so easy, so natural. I feel like I'm performing someone else's script. Reading those words, I realized how completely I'd misunderstood our dynamic. I'd always seen Sophie as the lucky one, the baby of the family who could do no wrong, who had the freedom to be creative and spontaneous while I carried the weight of being the responsible older child. I'd envied her ability to change majors 3 times without our parents panicking, her casual approach to deadlines and obligations. I'd never considered that what looked like freedom might actually feel like being adrift. The final entry was dated just 2 days before the accident, and the handwriting was shakier than usual, as if she'd been crying while she wrote. I overheard Mom and Dad talking about me last night. They're worried I'm not going to find a good job after graduation, that I'm not as focused as Maya was at my age. Dad said maybe they should have pushed me harder, the way they pushed Maya. Mom said they didn't want to stifle my creativity, but now they're wondering if being supportive meant they weren't being helpful enough. They're proud of me, but it's that gentle, concerned kind of pride you have for someone you're not quite sure is going to make it. I've been thinking about taking that road trip to California after graduation, just to clear my head and figure out what I actually want. But I'm scared they'll see it as more evidence that I'm irresponsible, that I'm not growing up the way Maya did. California. The night of the accident, Sophie had been driving north toward Portland from Eugene, but Highway 26 wasn't the direct route. I'd always wondered why she'd taken that winding mountain road in such terrible weather. Now I realized she might have been wrestling with decisions none of us knew she was facing, driving in circles both literally and metaphorically. I closed the diary and sat in the growing darkness of our childhood bedroom, watching the rain streak down windows that had witnessed countless shared secrets, late-night conversations, and the quiet rhythm of 2 sisters growing up side by side. How had I missed so much? How had I been so focused on being a good big sister, offering advice, celebrating her achievements, trying to support her dreams, that I'd never seen how my very existence might have been casting shadows over her sense of self? The house felt different now, charged with all the unspoken truths that had been living in the spaces between our words. Every family dinner where Sophie had seemed quiet, every phone call where she'd deflected my questions about her love life or career plans, every time she'd changed the subject when I tried to give her guidance, it all made sense now. She hadn't been avoiding my help because she didn't need it. She'd been avoiding it because she needed space to figure out who she was, when she wasn't being compared to me. I thought about all the times I'd felt guilty for moving out, for building a life that sometimes felt selfish in its independence. I'd worried that I wasn't being present enough, wasn't fulfilling my role as the big sister who was supposed to guide and protect. But maybe the most loving thing I could have done was step back, let her make mistakes, let her find her own way, without the weight of my example pressing down on her shoulders. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been worrying about being a good enough sister, Sophie had been drowning in the shadow of how good everyone thought I was. We'd both been performing versions of ourselves, me as the responsible, successful older daughter, her as the carefree, artistic younger one, and neither of us had been entirely honest about the cost of maintaining those roles. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "No change today. Coming home around 8, did you find Sophie's things?" I looked around the room, at the small pile of clothes I'd managed to fold before finding the diary, at the elephant still sitting on her pillow, at the fairy lights casting gentle shadows on walls that had absorbed 24 years of our shared history. I texted back, "Still working on it. Take your time at the hospital." Because I realized I needed more time in this space, surrounded by the evidence of a person I was only now beginning to truly see. Sophie had been keeping so many secrets, carrying so much weight, and I'd been floating through our relationship assuming that love and good intentions were enough to bridge any gap between us. But reading her diary had shown me that sometimes love isn't enough if it's built on assumptions. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we've been seeing through the lens of our own needs and expectations. Sophie hadn't needed me to be perfect. She'd needed me to be real, to show her that it was okay to struggle, okay to be uncertain, okay to want something different than what everyone expected. As evening settled over Portland and the rain continued its steady percussion against the roof, I made a decision. When Sophie woke up, and I had to believe she would wake up, I was going to tell her about reading her diary. I was going to apologize for all the ways I'd unknowingly made her feel small. And I was going to ask her to teach me how to be the kind of sister she actually needed, not the kind I thought she should want. Because the sister I'd discovered in those purple pages wasn't the girl I thought I'd grown up with. She was braver and more fragile, more thoughtful and more lost than I'd ever realized. She was someone who deserved to be seen clearly, without the filter of my own expectations, or the weight of comparisons that had shaped our family dynamic for so long. The diary sat on Sophie's desk now, closed but no longer hidden. Tomorrow I would go back to the hospital, sit beside her quiet form, and start the difficult work of rebuilding a relationship based on truth instead of assumption. I would tell her that she didn't need to be anything other than exactly who she was, that her worth had never been dependent on measuring up to anyone else's path. And maybe if I was lucky, when she finally opened her eyes, we could start over as the sisters we'd always had the potential to be, imperfect, honest, and free from the shadows that had kept us from really seeing each other. Part 2. The calm before the next morning arrived, with deceptive gentleness. Sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains of Sophie's bedroom, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that reminded me of the kaleidoscope we used to share as children. I had barely slept, my mind churning through fragments of her diary entries like a broken record player stuck on the same devastating song. The purple leather journal still sat on her desk where I'd left it, innocent-looking in the daylight, as if it hadn't completely rewritten the story of our sisterhood just hours before. Mom's voice drifted up from the kitchen, accompanied by the familiar sounds of morning routine: coffee brewing, toast popping, the gentle clink of ceramic mugs against the granite countertop. For a moment I could almost pretend that Sophie would come stumbling down the hallway any minute, her hair a mess from sleep, complaining about having an 8 a.m. class, or begging someone to drive her to campus because she'd forgotten to put gas in her car again. The normalcy of it felt like a cruel joke, this peaceful Saturday morning, that should have included all four of us gathered around the breakfast table, arguing over the last piece of Mom's banana bread, or planning what to do with the rare appearance of Portland sunshine. I dressed slowly, pulling on the same jeans I'd worn yesterday, not caring that they still smelled faintly like the hospital's antiseptic air. The person staring back at me in Sophie's full-length mirror looked hollow-eyed and older than 27, someone who'd aged a decade overnight. I'd always been the composed one, the sister who had her life figured out, but reading Sophie's private thoughts had left me feeling unmoored in a way I didn't know how to navigate. Downstairs, Dad sat at the kitchen island with his reading glasses perched on his nose, scrolling through emails on his tablet, while Mom bustled around making enough breakfast for 4 people out of habit. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of uncertainty that had settled over our house like fog. Dad's usually perfectly combed hair was sticking up at odd angles, and Mom's makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. We were all walking through the motions of normal life, while the most important piece of our family lay silent in a hospital bed across town. "How did you sleep, sweetheart?" Mom asked, not looking up from the pan where she was scrambling eggs with the mechanical precision of someone who needed to keep her hands busy. Her voice carried that carefully modulated tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is manageable, that hope is still a reasonable thing to cling to. "Fine," I lied, accepting the mug of coffee she pressed into my hands. It was made exactly the way I liked it: 2 sugars, a splash of cream, the kind of maternal attention to detail that usually made me feel loved, and now just reminded me of all the ways I'd failed to pay similar attention to Sophie's needs. Had I ever noticed how she liked her coffee? Did she even drink coffee, or was that another assumption I'd made without really looking? Dad glanced up from his tablet, his expression that particular blend of exhaustion and forced optimism that had become his default since the accident. "Dr. Martinez said they might try reducing the sedation today, see if there's any response. Her brain activity has been stable, which is encouraging." He spoke like he was reading from a medical textbook, each word carefully chosen to sound hopeful rather than desperate. I nodded, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic mug and trying to find comfort in its familiar weight. "That's good news." But even as I said it, I wondered what Sophie would think when she woke up, whether she'd be relieved to see us gathered around her bed, or whether our worried faces would just remind her of all the expectations she'd been struggling to meet. Would she want space to recover, or would she feel obligated to reassure us that she was okay, even if she wasn't? "I thought we could all go together this afternoon," Mom continued, her voice taking on that brightly determined quality that meant she was working hard to maintain momentum. "Maybe stop by the garden center first, let your father check on things, then head over around 2. The nurses said afternoon visits are usually better, less chaotic than the morning shift change." The garden center. Chen's garden supply had been Dad's pride and joy for 15 years, the immigrant success story that had allowed him to build the life he'd dreamed of when he first arrived from Taiwan. Sophie and I had spent countless summer afternoons there as kids, running between the rows of flowers and vegetables, while Dad helped customers select the perfect plants for their yards. Sophie had always gravitated toward the bright, chaotic wildflower mixes, while I'd preferred the neat, organized herb gardens. Even then, we'd been drawn to different kinds of beauty, different ways of growing. "Maya helped me pack some of Sophie's things yesterday," Mom added, glancing toward the canvas bag sitting by the back door. I'd managed to gather clothes, toiletries and a few comfort items before getting sidetracked by the diary, though looking at that innocent bag now felt like harboring a secret. Inside were the soft pajamas Sophie loved, her favorite vanilla lip balm, and the stuffed elephant that had been her companion through childhood nightmares and college homesickness. What I hadn't packed were any answers to the questions her diary had raised. Dad closed his tablet and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palm. "She's going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to us. "Sophie's strong. She's always been a fighter." But his voice cracked slightly on the word fighter, and I wondered if he was thinking about the same things I was. All the battles Sophie had been fighting that we'd never seen, all the strength she'd been using just to get through days that looked easy from the outside. Breakfast passed in the kind of subdued conversation that families have when they're all thinking about the same thing, but nobody knows how to address it directly. We talked about the weather, about whether the roses in the front yard would survive the early frost, about practical things like hospital parking and visiting hours. Safe topics that didn't require us to confront the magnitude of what we were all afraid of losing. But I found myself studying my parents with new eyes, trying to see them the way Sophie had described in her diary. Dad, who I'd always thought of as quietly proud of both his daughters, apparently had been worried that Sophie lacked the focus and drive that had made my path seem so straightforward. Mom, whose creative encouragement I'd envied when Sophie was allowed to change majors and explore different interests, had apparently been second-guessing whether that support had actually been helpful. How many family dinners had we sat through where Sophie felt like she was being measured against an invisible standard? How many times had I talked about work promotions or apartment hunting, or relationship milestones, while Sophie smiled and nodded, and felt like she was falling further behind in some race she'd never signed up to run. The casual updates I'd shared about my life, intended to stay connected, to include my family in my experiences, had apparently been building a wall between us that I'd never seen. I keep thinking about that art therapy program she mentioned. Mom said suddenly, breaking the careful rhythm of our morning small talk. The one at Portland State. She seemed so excited when she first told us about it, but then she never brought it up again. I wondered if we should have asked more questions, been more encouraging about that direction. My stomach clenched. Sophie had mentioned art therapy in her diary entries, describing it as something she was passionate about, but afraid to pursue, because it seemed less practical than the business degree our parents had originally been excited about. How many conversations had we had, where she'd started to share something real, something important to her, only to retreat, when she sensed that we expected something different. She'll have time to figure all that out when she recovers, Dad said firmly, but there was something brittle in his confidence. Young people change their minds about careers all the time. The important thing is that she gets better first. But I was beginning to understand that Sophie's struggle with direction hadn't been typical young adult indecision. It had been the paralysis of someone who felt like every choice would be judged against a standard she couldn't meet, someone who'd been trying to become a person she thought would make us proud, rather than discovering who she actually was. The career uncertainty, the relationship questions, the quiet withdrawal from family conversations, it had all been part of a larger pattern of someone trying to find herself while living in the shadow of expectations she couldn't escape. After breakfast, I found myself gravitating back towards Sophie's room, drawn by the need to understand more. The diary sat exactly where I'd left it, and I realized that reading it once hadn't been enough. There were layers to Sophie's experience that I'd only begun to uncover, nuances to her feelings, that deserved more attention than my middle-of-the-night emotional marathon had allowed. But this time I approached it differently. Instead of reading with the shock of discovery, I read with the careful attention of someone trying to truly listen. I paid attention to the dates, to the progression of her thoughts, to the way her handwriting changed depending on her mood. When she wrote about feeling overshadowed, her letters were smaller, more cramped, as if she was trying to take up less space even on the page. When she wrote about things that excited her, art projects, volunteer work with kids, books that had moved her, her handwriting opened up, became more flowing and confident. One entry from last spring caught my attention. Maya called today to tell me about Alex's promotion, and how they're thinking about looking at houses together. She sounded so happy, so settled, and I realized I've never felt that kind of certainty about anything. Even when I'm excited about something, there's always this voice in my head asking whether it's practical enough, whether it's impressive enough, whether it's the kind of thing Maya would do. I wish I could turn off that voice, just for one day, and see what choices I'd make if I wasn't constantly comparing myself to someone who seems to have life figured out in ways I never will. The entry was dated 3 days after I'd called her, bubbling with excitement about Alex's promotion to senior architect and our tentative plans to start house hunting. I remembered that conversation clearly, because Sophie had seemed so enthusiastic, asking questions about neighborhoods and mortgage rates, and whether we wanted a yard for future kids. I'd hung up feeling closer to her, feeling like she was genuinely interested in this next phase of my life. But reading her real response, I realized her enthusiasm had been another performance, another way of being the supportive little sister while her own dreams stayed locked away. Another entry, from just 2 months ago, painted an even clearer picture of the distance that had been growing between us. Maya invited me to dinner with her and Alex at that new restaurant downtown. I almost said no, because I knew it would be one of those conversations where they ask about my classes and my plans, and I give vague, cheerful answers, because the truth is too complicated to explain. How do I tell them that I'm terrified of graduating? That every job posting I look at feels like it was written for someone else? That sometimes I think about just disappearing for a while, going somewhere nobody knows me as Maya's sister, and trying to figure out who I am when I'm not being compared to anyone else? I closed my eyes, remembering that dinner. It had been at Kennard, a trendy spot in East Portland that I'd been wanting to try. Sophie had seemed a little quiet, but I'd attributed it to stress about final exams. Alex and I had dominated the conversation, talking about work projects and vacation plans, and the house setting that was starting to feel more serious. We'd asked Sophie about her classes, and she'd given us updates that sounded positive and engaged. I'd left that night feeling good about our relationship, feeling like Sophie was doing well, and that we'd had quality time together. But she'd been performing the entire evening, carefully crafting responses that would satisfy our curiosity without revealing the depth of her uncertainty. While Alex and I had been excitedly planning our future, Sophie had been sitting across from us feeling like she was watching a life she'd never be able to create for herself. The success that felt natural and achievable to me had seemed impossibly distant to her, not because she wasn't capable, but because she was measuring herself against a path that might not have been right for her in the first place. Reading entry after entry, I began to see how thoroughly I'd misunderstood our dynamic. I'd thought I was being a good big sister by sharing my experiences, offering advice when she asked for it, and including her in my life. But every story I'd told about work achievements or relationship milestones had been another reminder to Sophie of how far behind she felt. Every piece of advice, no matter how gently offered, had reinforced the idea that I had answers she was lacking. The most heartbreaking entries were the ones where she wrote about genuinely wanting to connect with me, but not knowing how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Sometimes I want to call Maya and tell her everything about therapy, about how lost I feel, about how scared I am that I'll never find something I'm passionate about the way she's passionate about her work. But then I imagine how she'd respond, all loving and concerned, and ready to help me make a plan to fix
Everything, and I realize that's not what I need. I don't need her to solve my problems. I need her to understand that having problems doesn't make me broken. That line hit me like a physical blow. I need her to understand that having problems doesn't make me broken. How many times had Sophie started to tell me something real, something vulnerable, only to have me jump into problem-solving mode? How many opportunities for genuine connection had I missed because I was so focused on being helpful that I forgot to just listen? I thought about the phone calls over the past few months, the ones where Sophie had seemed like she wanted to talk about something important but then shifted the conversation to safer topics. I'd interpreted her hesitation as typical college stress, nothing that couldn't be managed with a little big sister guidance. But she hadn't been looking for solutions. She'd been looking for permission to struggle, for reassurance that uncertainty and confusion were normal parts of growing up rather than character flaws that needed to be fixed. The morning light had shifted, filling Sophie's room with the kind of golden warmth that made everything look softer, more forgiving. But the comfort that sunshine usually brought felt hollow now, overshadowed by the weight of all the misunderstandings that had been building between us for years. I'd been so focused on being the kind of sister I thought Sophie needed, successful, stable, ready with advice, that I'd never asked what kind of sister she actually wanted. As I prepared to close the diary and get ready for the hospital visit, one final entry caught my eye. It was dated just 5 days before the accident, and the tone was different from the others. More resigned, more final. I've been thinking about taking that road trip after graduation, maybe driving down the coast to California and just seeing where I end up. Part of me thinks it would be good to have some time away from everyone's expectations, to figure out what I want when nobody's watching. But I know what everyone would think, that I'm being irresponsible, that I'm running away from my problems instead of facing them like Maya would. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe wanting space to think is just another way of being weak. That entry was like a knife to my chest. Sophie had been planning to give herself the gift of time and space, the opportunity to discover who she was without the weight of comparisons and expectations. But even that impulse toward self-discovery had been poisoned by the fear that wanting something different made her inadequate. She'd been trapped between the desire to find her own path and the terror that choosing differently would confirm everyone's worst fears about her lack of direction. The road trip she'd been considering might have been exactly what she needed, a chance to experience independence without the pressure of immediate decisions about career and relationships. But she'd talked herself out of it because she was afraid of how it would look to the rest of us, afraid that taking time to explore would be seen as another sign that she wasn't as focused and driven as she should be. I realized with horrible clarity that the night of the accident, Sophie might have been driving in circles both literally and metaphorically. She'd been heading north from Eugene, but taking the scenic route through the mountains, maybe trying to work through the decision about California, maybe feeling trapped between what she wanted to do and what she thought she should do. The storm that night had been fierce, but Sophie was a careful driver. What if she'd been so distracted by the weight of choices she felt she couldn't make that she'd lost focus on the road? The guilt hit me like a wave. Not guilt for causing the accident that had been weather and chance and circumstances beyond anyone's control, But guilt for all the ways I'd unknowingly contributed to the pressure Sophie had been feeling, for all the times my well-meaning presence in her life had made her feel smaller rather than supported. I'd spent years thinking I was being a good big sister, but I'd actually been inadvertently reinforcing every insecurity she had about her own worth and direction. Standing in that sun-filled bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of a person I was only now beginning to truly see, I made a promise to myself and to Sophie's unconscious form lying in the hospital across town. When she woke up, and she had to wake up, I was going to find a way to be the sister she actually needed, rather than the sister I thought she should want. I was going to learn how to listen without trying to fix, how to support without overshadowing, how to love without comparing. Because the sister I'd discovered in those purple pages deserved so much more than the careful performance she'd been giving us for years. She deserved to be seen clearly, to be valued for exactly who she was, rather than how closely she resembled someone else's idea of success. And maybe if I was very lucky and worked very hard, we might still have the chance to build the kind of relationship where she could be honest about her struggles without fearing they made her broken. The hospital visit was still hours away, but already I could feel the weight of everything I needed to say, and didn't know how to express. How do you apologize for assumptions you didn't know you were making? How do you rebuild trust that was damaged by love that came with conditions you never meant to impose? The road ahead felt as uncertain as the one Sophie had been traveling the night of the accident, but for the first time since reading her diary, I felt something that might have been hope. Part 3. The drive to Chen's garden supply felt longer than usual, even though Dad took the same route he'd been driving for 15 years. I sat in the back seat of their Honda Pilot, watching familiar Portland neighborhoods slide past the rain-streaked windows, while Mom made a list of things to grab from the store before heading to the hospital. Her handwriting was shakier than normal, and she kept crossing out items and rewriting them, as if getting the list perfect might somehow create order in a situation that felt completely out of control. We should check on the greenhouse heaters, Dad said, more to fill the silence than because it was urgent. This cold snap came earlier than expected. Don't want to lose the winter inventory before the holiday shopping season. His voice carried the forced normalcy of someone trying to convince himself that business concerns were still important when his youngest daughter was lying unconscious across town. The garden center parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few weekend customers browsing the outdoor displays of pumpkins and winter decorations. Dad had started transitioning to the fall inventory in September, transforming the bright summer explosion of annuals into the more subdued palette of chrysanthemums, ornamental cabbage, and the evergreen arrangements that would carry the business through the darker months. Sophie had always loved the autumn transformation, the way the greenhouse became a cozy refuge filled with rust-colored marigolds and the spicy scent of late-blooming herbs. Inside, the familiar smells of potting soil and fertilizer mixed with the cooler air of changing seasons. Maria, Dad's longtime assistant manager, looked up from the register where she was helping an elderly woman select bulbs for spring planting. Her face brightened when she saw us, then quickly shifted to the careful expression people wore when they weren't sure how much hope was appropriate. Chen, Mrs. Chen, she said, her slight accent making our family name sound musical in a way that always reminded me of home. How is Sophie today? We've been thinking about her, lighting candles at church. Maria had worked for Dad since Sophie and I were in high school, and she'd watched us grow up through weekend shifts and summer jobs. She knew Sophie's laugh, knew which plants she gravitated toward, knew the way she could charm even the most difficult customers with her genuine enthusiasm for growing things. No change yet, Mom replied, her voice steady but tight. But the doctors are optimistic. Her brain activity is good, and they're planning to reduce the sedation today. She spoke like she was reciting talking points, information that could be shared safely without venturing into the territory of fear that lived just beneath the surface. Dad nodded toward the greenhouse. Just wanted to check on a few things before we head over to the hospital. Make sure everything's running smoothly. But I could tell that the garden center was more than just a business obligation for him today. It was a place where life made sense, where problems had solutions and careful attention yielded predictable results. Unlike hospitals, where the best you could do was wait and hope, and trust that other people knew what they were doing. I followed my parents through the aisles of plants, past the neat rows of seasonal arrangements, and the corner where Dad kept his collection of exotic orchids. This place had been the backdrop for so many family memories, Sophie and me learning to repot plants when we were barely tall enough to reach the workbenches, helping with inventory during school breaks, bringing friends here in high school to show off the business our parents had built from nothing. But walking through it now, with Sophie's diary entries fresh in my mind, I started seeing it differently. This was also the place where Sophie had spent countless weekends, watching customers praise Dad's expertise and Mom's eye for design, while she arranged flowers or swept floors in the background. Had she felt invisible here too, another set of hands rather than a valued contributor? Had she been comparing herself to me even during those childhood summers, wondering why I seemed more comfortable talking to customers while she preferred working with the plants themselves? "Maya, come look at this." Mom called from near the back office. She was standing beside a display of potted herbs that I didn't remember from my last visit. The arrangement was beautiful, different varieties organized by height and color in a way that looked natural but clearly required an artistic eye. Small handwritten signs identified each plant and included care instructions along with suggestions for culinary uses. "Sophie put this together last month," Dad said, joining us near the display. "Customers have been asking for herb gardens, but they don't know which ones to choose or how to care for them. She created this whole system, the groupings, the signs, even the care sheets we give people when they purchase. Sales in the herb section are up 30% since she implemented it." I stared at the display, recognizing Sophie's artistic touch in the way the different shades of green played against each other, the way she'd positioned trailing varieties to soften the edges of more upright plants. It was beautiful and functional, creative and practical, exactly the kind of solution that combined her natural aesthetic sense with real problem-solving skills. Why hadn't she mentioned this project when we talked? Why hadn't any of us made a bigger deal about her contribution to the business? "She never told me about this," I said, running my fingers along one of the care sheets. Sophie's handwriting was neat and friendly, with little drawings of herbs in the margins that made the instructions feel more like invitations than rules. "It's brilliant. So much more helpful than just having everything mixed together." Dad's expression softened. "She's always been better with the plants than either of us. Has an instinct for what they need, what looks good together. I keep telling her she should consider landscape design, but she says it's too competitive, too hard to make a living at." He paused, looking at the herb display with new appreciation. "Maybe we haven't done enough to encourage her talents. Maybe we've been so focused on wanting her to be financially secure that we've overlooked what she's actually good at." The weight of that admission hung in the air between us. Here was concrete evidence of Sophie's capability, her ability to identify problems and create elegant solutions, her natural gift for making people feel welcome and supported in their growing endeavors. But instead of celebrating these strengths, we'd all been focused on the ways she didn't match the conventional markers of success that had defined my path. "She mentioned wanting to do art therapy," I said carefully, not wanting to reveal that I'd been reading her private thoughts but needing to share at least some of what I'd learned. "Working with kids who've been through trauma, combining art and psychology to help people heal." The words felt important in my mouth, like secrets Sophie should have been able to share freely instead of hiding them in diary pages. Mom's face changed, cycling through surprise and something that might have been regret. She mentioned that once, but then she never brought it up again. I thought she'd lost interest, moved on to something else. You know how she is, or how I thought she was, always exploring new ideas. But her voice trailed off, and I could see her reconsidering those assumptions, wondering how many of Sophie's abandoned topics had actually been dreams she'd talked herself out of pursuing. We spent another hour at the garden center, ostensibly checking on business details, but really just being in a space that felt connected to Sophie. Dad tested the greenhouse heaters and made notes about winter preparations. Mom reorganized a display of holiday planters that didn't really need reorganizing. I found myself gravitating toward the herb garden Sophie had created, trying to see it through her eyes, trying to understand what it had meant to her to build something beautiful and useful in this place that represented so much of our family's identity. When it was finally time to leave for the hospital, we gathered in the car with the awkward silence of people who had too much to think about, and no safe way to express it. The bag of Sophie's things sat in the back seat next to me, and I found myself checking it obsessively, as if making sure her favorite pajamas and stuffed elephant were still there, somehow ensure that she'd be awake to receive them. St. Mary's Medical Center looked the same as it had every day for the past 3 weeks, imposing and sterile, with 2 bright lights and the kind of industrial carpet designed to hide stains. But walking through those glass doors with Sophie's secrets weighing on my mind made everything feel different. The elevator ride to the ICU felt endless, filled with the artificial cheer of people trying to project optimism they didn't entirely feel. The waiting area outside the ICU had become uncomfortably familiar, with its cluster of mismatched chairs and the coffee machine that never quite worked properly. But today it wasn't empty. Alex was there, along with Emma Rodriguez, my best friend from college, who had driven up from Salem when she heard about the accident. And sitting near the window, looking uncomfortable but determined, was Chris Morrison, Sophie's lab partner from her psychology classes. "Maya," Emma said, standing to give me a hug that felt like coming home. She'd known Sophie since my college graduation party, had watched her grow from a shy high school student to the young woman she'd become. "Any changes today?" I shook my head, accepting hugs from Alex and awkward greetings from Chris, who I'd only met a handful of times. It felt strange to have our private family crisis become this gathering of concerned people, but also comforting in a way I hadn't expected. Sophie had touched all these lives, had mattered to people beyond our immediate family circle. "I brought some of her art supplies," Chris said, gesturing toward a canvas bag I hadn't noticed. "From her studio space in the psychology building. I thought maybe when she wakes up, she might want them." She's been working on this amazing series of drawings about healing, about what recovery looks like from the inside. Really powerful stuff. Art about healing. Another piece of Sophie's inner life that she'd shared with classmates, but never mentioned to family. I wondered what those drawings looked like, whether they revealed anything about her own need for healing, her own understanding of what it meant to recover from invisible wounds. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals master when they need to manage other people's hope. "The Chen family, I'd like to speak with you about Sophie's status today." We followed her into the small consultation room adjacent to the ICU, leaving our friends in the waiting area. The room was designed to feel comforting, but managed only to feel clinical. Soft lighting that couldn't hide the reality of difficult conversations, comfortable chairs that had absorbed too many tears, and desperate questions. "Sophie's neurological responses have been encouraging, Dr. Martinez began, consulting the tablet that seemed to contain my sister's entire existence, reduced to charts and numbers. "We've been gradually reducing the sedation, and her brain activity suggests she may be beginning to emerge from the coma. However, I want to prepare you for the fact that recovery isn't always linear. She may have periods of consciousness followed by longer stretches of sleep. And when she does wake up, she may be confused, may not remember details about the accident, or even recent events." The careful medical language felt like a foreign language, full of qualifiers and possibilities, rather than the certainties we all desperately wanted. Mom reached for Dad's hand, and I watched their fingers intertwine with the practiced comfort of people who'd been facing life's uncertainties together for 3 decades. "Can we see her?" Dad asked, his voice steady but strained. "Can we talk to her even if she's not fully conscious?" "Absolutely," Dr. Martinez said, her expression softening slightly. "Many patients report hearing familiar voices during emergence from coma. Keep your conversations calm and positive, but feel free to share normal family updates, memories, anything that might help orient her to familiar relationships and experience." Normal family updates. I thought about Sophie's herb garden at the store, about the drawings Chris had mentioned, about all the aspects of her life that we'd somehow missed, despite being the people who were supposed to know her best. What counted as normal for a family that had been living with fundamental misunderstandings for years? The ICU itself was a maze of sophisticated medical equipment surrounding beds that looked too small for the enormity of what was happening in them. Sophie's room was the third door on the right, and seeing her never got easier. She looked impossibly young against the white hospital linens, her dark hair spread across the pillow, in a way that reminded me of childhood mornings, when she'd climb into my bed after nightmares, seeking comfort in the presence of someone who loved her. But she wasn't a child anymore, and the nightmares she'd been facing were more complex than monsters under the bed. The machines surrounding her bed beeped and hummed with the rhythm of artificial support, monitoring functions that should have been automatic, but weren't quite ready to work independently yet. Her face was peaceful, unmarked by the anxiety and uncertainty that had filled her diary pages, as if unconsciousness had given her a reprieve from the weight of expectations she'd been carrying. Mom immediately went to Sophie's bedside, touching her hand with the careful gentleness of someone afraid of disturbing important medical equipment. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're all here, Maya and Dad and everyone who loves you. You just rest and get better, okay? Everything else can wait." But as I watched Mom stroke Sophie's hair, and Dad adjust the blanket that didn't need adjusting, I realized that everything else couldn't wait. The conversations we'd been avoiding, the assumptions we'd been making, the ways we'd all been performing versions of ourselves, instead of being honest about what we needed, all of that would still be there when Sophie woke up. And this time, I was determined to do better. Standing in that sterile room, surrounded by the people who loved Sophie most, I made another silent promise. When she opened her eyes, I wasn't going to ask her how she was feeling, or what she remembered, or whether she needed anything. I was going to tell her that I'd found her diary, that I'd read her truth, and that I was sorry it had taken an accident for me to really see her. Because the gathering around her bed wasn't just about waiting for her to wake up, it was about all of us waking up to the person she'd been. Part 4. The first crack, the first sign that something was changing, came not from Sophie, but from the way the machines around her bed began to shift their rhythm. I'd been sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair for nearly 2 hours, reading a magazine I wasn't absorbing, while Mom and Dad took turns holding Sophie's hand and speaking to her in the gentle, encouraging tones people use with sleeping children. The steady beeping and humming of medical equipment had become background noise, as familiar as breathing after 3 weeks of hospital vigils. But something was different now. The monitor displaying Sophie's brain activity showed more frequent spikes, patterns that looked less like the smooth waves of deep unconsciousness, and more like the jagged peaks and valleys of someone dreaming. Dr. Martinez had mentioned that emerging from a coma often began with increased neural activity. The brain slowly remembering how to process consciousness. Maya, Mom said softly, not taking her eyes off Sophie's face. Look at her eyes. I leaned forward, studying my sister's features for any sign of change. For just a moment, I thought I saw her eyelids flutter, the barely perceptible movement of someone trying to surface from deep sleep. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make my heart race, with a combination of hope and terror that I wasn't prepared for. Should we call the nurse? Dad asked, but even as he spoke, Sophie's face had settled back into the peaceful stillness that had defined her appearance for weeks. If we hadn't all been watching so carefully, we might have missed it entirely. Let's give it a few minutes, I suggested, though my hands were trembling slightly as I reached for my phone to text Emma and Alex in the waiting room. She might just be starting to respond to the reduced sedation. But internally I was panicking. I wasn't ready for Sophie to wake up. I hadn't figured out how to tell her about reading her diary. Hadn't prepared for the conversation that would inevitably follow. Hadn't worked through my own guilt about all the ways I'd unknowingly contributed to her struggles. Over the next hour, the small signs multiplied. Sophie's breathing became slightly less mechanical, more variable, as if her body was remembering how to regulate itself without complete medical assistance. Her fingers twitched occasionally, and once I was certain I saw her head turn slightly toward the sound of Dad's voice when he told her about checking on the garden center's greenhouse heaters. But the most significant moment came when Dr. Martinez arrived for her afternoon rounds. She performed the standard neurological assessments, checking pupil response and testing reflexes with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done these examinations thousands of times. But when she spoke Sophie's name, in a clear, firm voice, and asked her to squeeze her fingers if she could hear, something remarkable happened. Sophie's right hand, the one that had been motionless for 3 weeks, except for the occasional unconscious twitch, closed slowly around Dr. Martinez's fingers. It wasn't a strong grip, wasn't sustained for more than a few seconds, but it was undeniably intentional. Sophie had heard her name, and responded, bridging the gap between unconsciousness and awareness, in a way that made the sterile hospital room feel suddenly charged with possibility. That's excellent, Dr. Martinez said, her professional composure unable to completely hide her satisfaction. Sophie, can you do that again for me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. This time Sophie's response was even clearer. Her fingers closed around Dr. Martinez with more deliberate pressure, and her eyelids fluttered more noticeably, as if she was fighting to open them but couldn't quite manage the effort yet. Mom gasped softly, and I saw tears beginning to form in Dad's eyes, as he watched his younger daughter slowly begin her journey back to consciousness. Sophie, this is Dr. Martinez, she continued, her voice taking on the tone medical professionals use when they're speaking to someone who might be listening, but can't respond normally. Yet. You're in the hospital, and you're safe. Your family is here with you. Don't try to open your eyes, or speak yet. Just focus on listening to my voice, and squeezing my hand when you can hear me. Another squeeze, this one lasting longer, accompanied by a soft sound from Sophie's throat that wasn't quite a moan, but was definitely more vocalization than we'd heard since the accident. The machines around her bed registered the changes, with altered rhythms and new patterns of activity that looked like waking up, sounded when translated into electronic beeps and digital displays. Dr. Martinez spent several more minutes conducting gentle assessments, asking Sophie to move different fingers, to turn her head slightly, to respond to simple yes or no questions with hand squeezes. Sophie's responses were inconsistent, sometimes clear and immediate, sometimes delayed or absent, but the pattern was unmistakably one of someone emerging from the deep unconsciousness that had protected her brain while it healed from the trauma of the accident.
Hey!
This is very encouraging, Dr. Martinez told us once she'd completed her examination. Sophie is definitely beginning to emerge from the coma. Her responses suggest that her cognitive functions are intact, though it may take time for her to fully regain consciousness and awareness of her surroundings. I want to continue monitoring her closely, and I'd recommend that family members take turns staying with her. Familiar voices and gentle conversation can be very helpful during this transition period.
Hey!
After Dr. Martinez left, we settled into a new kind of waiting. This wasn't the helpless vigil of the past 3 weeks, where our presence felt more symbolic than practical. Now there was a sense that Sophie might actually be aware of us, might be processing our words, and drawing comfort from our proximity. It changed the weight of everything we said, and did in that sterile room. Mom began telling Sophie about the garden center, about how Maria had been asking about her, and how the herb display she'd created was still generating compliments from customers. Dad shared updates about the business, about preparations for the holiday season, about the new shipment of winter bulbs that had arrived that morning. Their voices carried the forced cheerfulness of people, trying to sound normal, while everything felt profoundly abnormal. But I found myself struggling to contribute to the gentle stream of family conversation. Every mundane update felt weighted with the knowledge I'd gained from reading Sophie's diary. How could I casually mention work projects or weekend plans when I knew how those kinds of updates had made Sophie feel? How could I pretend that our family dynamic was healthy and supportive when I'd seen evidence of how deeply she'd been struggling with feelings of inadequacy and invisibility? Instead, I found myself studying Sophie's face for signs of response, looking for clues about what she might be experiencing as consciousness slowly returned. Did she remember the accident? Was she aware of how much time had passed? Was she relieved to hear our voices, or was she already feeling the weight of having to reassure us that she was okay when she might not be ready for that burden yet? Around 4 o'clock, Emma and Alex joined us in Sophie's room, bringing coffee and sandwiches that none of us had thought to request, but all desperately needed. The hospital cafeteria food had become a tasteless necessity over the past weeks, but Emma had stopped at a local deli and brought real sustenance: turkey and avocado on sourdough bread, still warm soup in containers that smelled like comfort and normalcy. Any more responses? Emma asked quietly, settling into one of the extra chairs that the nursing staff had provided, when they realized Sophie might be having multiple visitors during her emergence from the coma. A few hand squeezes, I replied, unwrapping the sandwich.
Hey!
I wasn't sure I could eat despite being hungry for the first time in
Hey!
Dr. Martinez thinks she's definitely waking up, but it could take time for her to be fully conscious and oriented.
Hey!
Alex nodded, his architect's mind probably trying to imagine the complex process of rebuilding consciousness, the way he approached structural engineering problems. He'd been incredibly supportive during the past 3 weeks, understanding when I needed to cancel dinner plans or leave work early for hospital visits.
Never making me feel guilty for the way crisis had temporarily reorganized my priorities. As we ate our late lunch, I noticed that Sophie's breathing pattern had changed again. It was less mechanical, more natural, with occasional deeper breaths that suggested her body was remembering how to regulate itself without complete medical support. Her face looked less peaceful too, more like someone dreaming vividly rather than someone suspended in deep unconsciousness. "Sophie," I said softly, setting down my sandwich and moving closer to her bedside. "It's Maya. I'm here with Mom and Dad and Emma and Alex. We've all been waiting for you to wake up." I paused, unsure how much to say, how personal to get with an audience. "There's so much I want to talk to you about when you're ready." For a moment nothing happened. Then Sophie's head turned slightly toward my voice, and her eyelids fluttered more dramatically than they had all day. This time, her eyes actually opened for a few seconds, unfocused and confused, but definitely open. She looked directly at me without seeming to see me, her gaze distant and uncertain, before her eyes closed again and she settled back into what looked like sleep. "Did you see that?" Mom asked, her voice pitched higher with excitement and relief.
She opened her eyes. She actually looked at Maya. Dad was already reaching for the call button to summon a nurse, but I found myself frozen by what I'd seen in Sophie's brief moment of consciousness. Even in her confused, disoriented state, there had been something in her expression that reminded me of the emotional distance I'd read about in her diary. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of wariness, as if even in her vulnerable state she was already preparing to manage other people's expectations and emotions. Nurse Patricia arrived within minutes, a kind woman in her 50s who'd been part of Sophie's care team since the accident. She repeated some of the assessments Dr. Martinez had performed earlier, checking pupil response and testing Sophie's ability to follow simple commands. Sophie's responses were more consistent now, more sustained, though she still seemed to be drifting in and out of full awareness. "This is exactly what we hope to see," Nurse Patricia told us with genuine warmth. "The emergence from coma is often gradual, with periods of increased responsiveness followed by longer stretches of restorative sleep. Don't be discouraged if she seems awake one moment and deeply asleep the next. Her brain is doing enormous work right now, rebuilding the connections and pathways that will allow her to return to full consciousness." Over the next several hours, Sophie's periods of responsiveness became longer and more frequent. She began to track movement with her eyes when they were open, following voices and faces in a way that suggested growing awareness of her surroundings. She started making soft sounds, not words yet, but vocalizations that seemed intentional rather than involuntary. But the moment that truly cracked something open in my chest came around 7 o'clock, when Sophie opened her eyes and looked directly at me with unmistakable recognition. Her gaze was still somewhat unfocused, still clouded with confusion and medication, but she definitely saw me. She knew who I was. "Maya," she whispered, her voice barely audible and rough from weeks of intubation, but absolutely clear in its intent. "I'm here," I said, reaching for her hand and feeling her fingers close around mine with more strength than she'd shown all day. "I'm right here, Sophie. You're going to be okay." But even as I said the words, I saw something complex pass across her features. Relief at seeing a familiar face, yes, but also something else, a kind of automatic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the beginning of the performance I'd read about in her diary entries. Even in this moment of vulnerable awakening, Sophie was already starting to manage her presentation, to be the person she thought we needed her to be rather than expressing whatever she was actually feeling. She started to ask, then stopped, her throat clearly still too damaged from the breathing tube to support much conversation. "You're in the hospital," Mom said, moving to Sophie's other side and stroking her hair with gentle maternal touches. "You were in a car accident 3 weeks ago, but you're going to be fine. You just need to rest and recover." Sophie's eyes moved between our faces, taking in the information and trying to process the gap in her memory. I could see her working to understand what had happened, to piece together the missing time, to figure out what was expected of her now that she was conscious again. "Don't worry about remembering everything right now," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control. "The important thing is that you're awake and you're going to be okay. Everything else can wait until you're stronger." But I could see in Sophie's expression that she was already worrying about everything else. Even in her weak and disoriented state, she was trying to assess how her condition was affecting the rest of us, trying to gauge what level of reassurance and recovery performance would be required to ease our concerns. "Sophie," I said, squeezing her hand more firmly to get her attention. "Don't try to be okay for us right now, just focus on how you're feeling. What do you need?" The question seemed to surprise her. Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked at me with something that might have been gratitude mixed with confusion, as if the idea of being asked about her own needs rather than being told not to worry about ours was unexpected. "Tired," she whispered, the single word encompassing more than just physical exhaustion. "Everything tired," and in that moment, I heard an echo of the emotional fatigue that had filled her diary entries, the weariness that came from constantly managing other people's expectations while struggling to understand her own needs and desires. She wasn't just tired from the accident and the coma, she was tired from years of performing a version of herself that felt safe but didn't feel true. Martinez returned for an evening assessment, pleased with Sophie's progress, but cautioning us not to overwhelm her with too much stimulation or too many questions. Sophie's brain was working hard to rebuild normal function, and she needed plenty of rest to support that recovery process. She may experience some confusion about recent events, some difficulty with memory formation, and certainly some emotional volatility as her neurochemistry stabilizes. Dr. Martinez explained, "It's important to be patient with the recovery process and not to expect too much too quickly." As visiting hours wound down and we prepared to leave Sophie for the night, I struggled with whether to say anything about the diary. Part of me wanted to clear the air immediately, to let her know that I'd discovered her secrets, and that we needed to have honest conversations about our family dynamic. But another part of me recognized that she was still too fragile, too overwhelmed with the basic work of recovery, to handle complex emotional revelations. "I'll be back tomorrow," I told Sophie, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Get some rest, and don't worry about anything except getting better." She nodded weakly, but I could see in her eyes that she was already starting to worry about everything, about how the accident had affected our family, about what it meant for her college plans, about whether she was disappointing everyone by being injured and vulnerable when we needed her to be strong. Leaving the hospital that night felt different than it had for the past 3 weeks. Instead of the helpless sadness of visiting someone who couldn't respond, I was carrying the weight of having seen Sophie begin to wake up and immediately fall back into the patterns of performance and self-protection that had been slowly consuming her before the accident. The crack in our family's careful facade had started with Sophie's tentative awakening, but I realized it was going to take much more than consciousness for any of us to truly heal from the damage that had been building for years. Sophie was going to wake up to the same expectations and assumptions that had been weighing on her before the accident, unless we found the courage to acknowledge how fundamentally we'd misunderstood each other. Driving home through the Portland night, with rain beginning to fall again in patterns that reminded me of the storm that had changed everything, I knew that Sophie's physical recovery was going to be the easy part. The real work, learning how to be honest with each other, how to love without conditions, how to support without overwhelming, was just beginning. Part 5. The main blow. Sophie had been conscious for 3 days when she delivered the words that shattered what remained of my carefully constructed understanding of our sisterly relationship. She was sitting up in her hospital bed for the first time, her dark hair clean and brushed back from her face, wearing the soft purple pajamas I'd brought from home. To anyone looking from the outside, she appeared to be recovering beautifully, alert, responsive, asking appropriate questions about her condition and treatment plan. But I'd been watching her more carefully now, looking for the signs I'd learned to recognize from reading her diary. The way she smiled whenever medical staff entered the room, instantly transforming from someone who looked exhausted and overwhelmed to someone who appeared grateful and optimistic. The way she deflected questions about pain or discomfort, always insisting she was feeling much better than she had the day before. The way she asked about everyone else's well-being, while avoiding direct answers about her own emotional state. Dr. Martinez had explained that Sophie's memories of the accident itself might never return fully, that the brain often protects itself by not encoding traumatic experiences that occur just before loss of consciousness. But her memories of everything leading up to that night were intact, and I could see her processing the implications of 3 weeks of lost time. 3 weeks during which our entire family had been forced to confront the possibility of losing her. "I keep thinking about how scared you all must have been," Sophie said that Tuesday afternoon, her voice still slightly hoarse, but growing stronger each day. "I hate that I put you through that. I hate that I was so careless, driving in that storm when I should have just stayed in Eugene until it passed." Mom immediately moved to reassure her, launching into the familiar litany of comfort we'd all been providing since she woke up. It wasn't her fault. The roads were dangerous that night. She couldn't have predicted what would happen. All the logical, reasonable things people say when someone they love is struggling with guilt and self-blame. But I found myself studying Sophie's face as she accepted these reassurances, and I recognized something from her diary entries. The way she absorbed other people's emotional work, their need to comfort and protect her, without necessarily believing or finding peace in their words. She was performing recovery for our benefit, managing our guilt and fear, while still carrying the weight of whatever had driven her to take that mountain road in the middle of a storm. "Sophie," I said carefully, "what were you thinking about that night? Before the accident, I mean. Were you upset about something?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mom and Dad looked at me with slight surprise, as if wondering why I was pushing Sophie to remember something potentially distressing when she was still so fragile. But Sophie's expression shifted in a way that told me the question had hit something real, something she'd been avoiding since regaining consciousness. I was just thinking, she said, her fingers picking at the hospital blanket in a gesture I remembered from childhood, something she did when she was trying to avoid saying something difficult. About school, about what comes next after graduation. You know how it is, all those big life decisions that seem impossible to figure out. It was a reasonable answer, the kind of thing any college senior might say about the transition to post-graduation life. But I could hear the careful editing in her response, the way she was reducing whatever complex emotional experience she'd been having to something simple and universally relatable. Were you feeling pressure about those decisions? I pressed, ignoring the warning look Mom was giving me. Like you had to have everything figured out. Sophie's hand stilled on the blanket, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. I saw something raw and vulnerable flash across her features before she caught herself, and rebuilt the smile that had become her default expression since waking up. Maybe a little, she admitted, but then quickly added, nothing I couldn't handle though, just normal college stress. Everyone goes through it. But I could see in her eyes that it hadn't been normal, that the pressure she'd been feeling had been anything but manageable. And I realized that even now, even in this hospital bed surrounded by people who loved her, Sophie was still protecting us from the full truth of her experience. She was still performing the role of the sister who didn't want to be a burden, who could handle whatever life threw at her without requiring too much support or understanding. That's when I made the decision that would change everything between us. Sophie, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I need to tell you something. While you were unconscious, I was helping Mom pack some of your things from your room. I found your diary. The words dropped into the quiet hospital room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and understanding that spread outward to touch everyone present. Sophie's face went pale, her eyes widening with a combination of horror and resignation that told me she knew exactly what I'd discovered in those purple pages. Maya, Mom said sharply, this isn't the time. I read it, I continued, my eyes locked on Sophie's face. I read about how you've been feeling invisible, about the therapy you've been in, about feeling like you're always being compared to me. I read about the pressure you've been carrying, about feeling like you can't be honest about struggling because everyone expects you to be okay. Sophie's breath caught, and I watched her carefully constructed composure completely collapse. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't the gentle tears of someone feeling sorry for herself. They were the desperate, relieved tears of someone who'd been holding a secret too heavy to carry, and was finally being seen for who she really was. You weren't supposed to find that, she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Nobody was supposed to know about any of that. But I did find it, I said, moving closer to her bed despite the tension radiating from our parents. And I'm so sorry, Sophie. I'm sorry that I never saw how much you were struggling. I'm sorry that my success made you feel like you were failing. I'm sorry that I never asked the right questions or created space for you to be honest about what you were going through. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maya, Sophie's still recovering. Maybe this conversation should wait until. No, Sophie said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. No, it shouldn't wait. I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not. She looked directly at me, and for the first time since she'd woken up, I saw her dropping the performance entirely. I've been drowning, Maya, for years, and the worst part is that everyone thinks I'm just floating along, not taking anything seriously, when really I've been working so hard to keep my head above water that I forgot how to swim. The metaphor hit me like a physical blow, so perfectly capturing what I'd read in her diary entries, but had never been able to articulate myself. Sophie hadn't been careless, or unfocused or lacking in direction. She'd been using all her energy just to survive the pressure of living in the shadow of expectations she couldn't meet. I didn't know, I said, reaching for her hand and feeling grateful when she didn't pull away. I thought I was being supportive, being a good big sister. I had no idea that my life was making you feel bad about yours. Sophie squeezed my hand, and I could feel some of the tension leaving her body as the truth finally occupied the space between us. It's not your fault, she said, but her voice was still thick with emotion. You never did anything wrong. You've always been kind to me, always been there when I needed help. But I needed something different than help. I needed permission to not have everything figured out. Mom and Dad sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that their younger daughter had been struggling with depression and anxiety, while they'd been worried about her lack of career focus. I could see them recalibrating their understanding of Sophie's behavior over the past few years, recognizing patterns they'd misinterpreted as immaturity or lack of ambition. The night of the accident, Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength, as she finally gave voice to thoughts she'd been holding inside for too long. I was driving around trying to decide whether to take that road trip to California. I'd been planning it for months, thinking maybe if I could just get away from everyone's expectations for a while, I could figure out who I was supposed to be. But then I started thinking about how disappointed everyone would be if I graduated, and immediately took off instead of looking for a real job. She paused, wiping her eyes with the tissue. Mom silently handed her. I was going in circles, literally and figuratively. Thinking about how Maya had everything so together at my age, how she'd never needed to run away to figure herself out. Thinking about how I was probably just proving that I was as irresponsible and unfocused as everyone suspected. The admission hung in the air like an indictment of everything our family had failed to understand about each other. Sophie had been so consumed with self-doubt and comparison that she'd lost track of the dangerous road she was driving, lost focus on the storm that had been building around her both literally and metaphorically. I never wanted you to feel like you had to be like me, I said, my own voice cracking with emotion. I never wanted my choices to become a standard you felt like you had to meet. I wanted you to find your own path, to be happy with whatever you chose. But how could I know that? Sophie asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, just genuine confusion. Everyone always talked about how proud they were of you, how well you were doing, how you had everything figured out. Nobody ever said it was okay for me to take time to figure things out, to make mistakes, to want something different than what looked successful from the outside. It was then that I realized the magnitude of what had been broken in our family dynamic. We'd all been so focused on supporting each other in the ways we thought were helpful that we'd never learned how to create space for struggle, for uncertainty, for the messy process of becoming whoever we were meant to be. Sophie had been suffocating under the weight of love that came with conditions she couldn't meet. The art therapy program, I said, remembering the entry from her diary. You never told us how much that meant to you. Sophie's face brightened slightly, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since she'd regained consciousness. I've been working with kids who've been through trauma, using art to help them process experiences they can't put into words. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done, but it doesn't pay well, and it requires additional certification, and it's not the kind of stable career path that would make anyone proud. It would make me proud, Dad said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie, if that's what you're passionate about, if that's the work that feels important to you, then that's what you should do. We just want you to be happy. But Sophie shook her head, still crying but now with a mixture of relief and frustration. But how was I supposed to know that? Every conversation about my future focused on practical concerns, salary, job security, benefits. Nobody ever asked me what felt meaningful, what kind of impact I wanted to have in the world. The truth of that observation settled over us like a heavy blanket. We'd all been so concerned with Sophie's practical success that we'd never asked about her deeper sense of purpose. We'd assumed that happiness would naturally follow financial stability, that meaning would emerge once she had a secure career foundation. I've been in therapy for 2 years, Sophie continued, her voice steadying as she claimed more of her truth. Not because I'm broken or mentally ill, but because I needed help figuring out who I was when I wasn't being compared to anyone else. Dr. Williams has been helping me understand that my worth isn't dependent on matching someone else's achievements. The fact that Sophie had been seeking professional help for so long without any of us knowing felt like another indictment of how thoroughly we'd misunderstood each other. She'd been getting support for struggles we didn't even realize she was having, working on issues that we'd never created space to discuss as a family. I'm so sorry, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry that we made you feel like you couldn't talk to us about this. I thought I was being supportive by not pressuring you about career decisions, but I realize now that might have felt like indifference. Sophie reached for Mom's hand, and I watched my mother and sister connect in a way that felt more honest than any interaction I'd witnessed between them in years. I didn't know how to tell you I was struggling without making it seem like I was making excuses or asking you to fix everything. I needed space to figure things out, but I also needed to know that you'd still love me if I never figured anything out. The conversation continued for another hour, with each of us slowly acknowledging the ways we'd misunderstood and failed each other, while still loving deeply and meaning well. Sophie talked about the weight of feeling like the family disappointment, about the anxiety that had consumed her when she tried to make decisions about her future, about the loneliness of carrying struggles she felt she couldn't share. Mom and Dad talked about their own fears, that they weren't providing enough guidance, that they were failing to prepare Sophie for the realities of adult life, that their own immigrant experience had made them too focused on security, and not focused enough on happiness and fulfillment. And I talked about the guilt I'd been carrying since reading her diary, about realizing that my well-intentioned support had sometimes felt like pressure, about wanting to learn how to be the kind of sister Sophie actually needed rather than the kind I thought she should want. But the main blow to our family's careful equilibrium came when Sophie looked directly at me and said the words that would reshape everything I thought I knew about love and support, and what it meant to truly see someone you care about. "Maya," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. "I love you so much and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. But I need you to know that your success has felt like a shadow I could never step out of. And I need to find out who I am when I'm not being measured against anyone else's life." The words hung in the sterile hospital air like a diagnosis, a truth that explained so much about the distance that had been growing between us, despite our mutual love and good intentions. Sophie needed space to discover herself without the weight of comparison, and I needed to learn how to love her without unconsciously imposing the standards that had shaped my own path. Everything I thought I knew about being a good sister cracked open in that moment, revealing the assumptions and expectations that had been shaping our relationship for years. The main blow wasn't anger or blame. It was the devastating clarity of finally understanding how love could become a burden when it came wrapped in conditions the beloved couldn't meet. And in that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of machines, and the smell of antiseptic and the weight of years of misunderstanding, we began the difficult work of learning how to love each other without shadows, without comparisons, without the performance that had been slowly suffocating the most important relationships in our lives. Part 4. The resolution. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the gallery space of the Portland Art Museum, watching Sophie guide a group of teenagers through an exhibition of paintings created by young people who had experienced trauma. Her voice was confident and warm as she explained how art could be a language for emotions that had no words, how creating something beautiful could be an act of reclaiming power over experiences that had made them feel powerless. The transformation in my sister was remarkable, but it hadn't happened overnight. The weeks following her revelation in the hospital had been messy and difficult, filled with conversations that none of us knew how to navigate and emotions that had been buried for too long under layers of good intentions and misunderstanding. Sophie's physical recovery had been the straightforward part. Her body had healed according to predictable timelines, responding to treatment and therapy in ways that medical professionals could chart and measure. But the emotional recovery had required all of us to fundamentally reconsider who we were to each other, and what we needed from our relationships. Sophie had moved back home temporarily, after being discharged from the hospital, not because she needed constant medical supervision, but because she'd asked for time and space to figure out her next steps without the pressure of maintaining an independent apartment, and all the responsibilities that came with it. Those first few weeks had been awkward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sophie was different. More direct, less concerned with managing other people's comfort, more willing to state her needs clearly, even when they weren't convenient for the rest of us. She'd asked for mornings alone to journal and think, for family dinners without pressure to share details about her recovery process, for space to meet with Dr. Williams twice a week, without having to explain what they discussed. Initially, I'd struggled with this new version of my sister. I was used to Sophie being accommodating, flexible, willing to adjust her needs to fit around everyone else's preferences. This new Sophie had boundaries, opinions, and a willingness to disappoint people if that's what honoring her own truth required. It forced me to examine how much of my love for her had been dependent on her being easy to love, how much I'd appreciated her agreeableness without recognizing the cost it extracted from her authentic self. The conversation about her diary had opened floodgates that couldn't be closed again. Sophie began sharing experiences and feelings she'd been hiding for years, not in dramatic revelations, but in small daily mentions that painted a picture of someone who'd been carrying much more than any of us had realized. She talked about panic attacks during job interviews, about changing her major 3 times because she kept choosing paths that seemed practical rather than About the loneliness of feeling like she couldn't be honest about her struggles, without becoming a problem that needed to be solved. Mom and Dad had their own reckoning to face. They spent hours talking to Dr. Williams about how their immigrant experience had shaped their approach to parenting, how their focus on stability and achievement had inadvertently created pressure that Sophie experienced as conditional love. They learned about the difference between support that empowers and support that overwhelms, about how to ask questions that invited truth, rather than questions that sought reassurance. For my part, I had to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own role in Sophie's struggles. I'd spent years thinking of myself as the good big sister, supportive, encouraging, always ready with advice and assistance. But reading Sophie's diary and listening to her honest account of our relationship had forced me to recognize how my well-intentioned involvement in her life had sometimes felt like interference, how my successes had become an invisible standard against which she measured her own worth. The hardest conversation we'd had occurred about 2 months after the accident, when Sophie had finally felt strong enough to address the deeper implications of what my reading her diary meant for our relationship going forward. We'd been sitting in our childhood bedroom, where the diary still lived on her desk like a bridge between the secrets she'd kept and the honesty she was learning to practice. "I need to know that you understand why I wrote those things," Sophie
had said, her voice steady but serious. "I need to know that you can hear how I've been feeling without trying to fix it or explain it away or make it better." The request had been harder to honor than I'd expected. My instinct was to apologize, to promise to do better, to create action plans for rebuilding our relationship. But Sophie hadn't wanted solutions. She'd wanted acknowledgement, validation, the simple recognition that her experience had been real and difficult and worthy of being witnessed without being immediately transformed into something more manageable. "I wrote about feeling invisible because I did feel invisible," she'd continued. "Not because anyone was intentionally ignoring me, but because the person everyone saw and responded to wasn't the person I actually was. I was performing a version of myself that seemed safer, easier, less likely to cause concern or disappointment." Listening to Sophie claim her truth had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. She was learning to speak about her experience with a clarity that I envied, owning her struggles without shame while also refusing to minimize their impact on her life. The therapy she'd been in had clearly been doing important work, helping her develop language for emotions and experiences that our family had never learned to discuss openly. The decision about her future had taken months to resolve, and it hadn't looked anything like the neat linear progression that my own post-graduation transition had followed. Sophie had deferred her original job interviews, turned down offers that felt wrong even though they looked impressive on paper, and spent time volunteering with organizations that worked with adolescents who'd experienced trauma. She'd discovered art therapy almost by accident, through a volunteer position at a residential treatment facility for teenagers who'd been removed from their homes due to abuse or neglect. Working with kids who'd survived experiences that had shattered their sense of safety and trust, Sophie had found her calling in helping them rebuild their relationship with creativity, with self-expression, with the possibility that beauty could emerge from the most painful experiences. The certification program she'd enrolled in was demanding and expensive, requiring additional coursework in both psychology and fine arts. It would take 2 more years to complete, and even then the career prospects were uncertain. Art therapy was a growing field, but one that often required building a private practice or working within institutions that had limited funding for creative approaches to healing. But watching Sophie talk about her work, seeing the light in her eyes when she described helping a 13-year-old, who hadn't spoken in months, create a painting that expressed everything she couldn't say aloud, I knew she'd found the path that was right for her. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, wasn't the path that would lead to financial security or conventional markers of success, but it was authentically hers in a way that made all the uncertainty feel worthwhile. Our family dynamics had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Family dinners now included check-ins about emotional well-being, alongside updates about work and practical concerns. Mom and Dad asked different kinds of questions, not just about what Sophie was doing, but about how she was feeling about what she was doing, whether she felt supported, whether there was anything she needed that she wasn't getting. I'd learned to share my own struggles more openly, to talk about the parts of my life that weren't going smoothly instead of only reporting successes and achievements. It had been surprisingly difficult to break the habit of presenting my life as a series of accomplishments, but I'd realized that my constant positivity had inadvertently made Sophie feel like struggle was something to be ashamed of, rather than a normal part of human experience. The evening I was watching Sophie lead the museum tour marked a significant milestone in her recovery and our family's healing.
She'd been selected to facilitate the final event in a series of community workshops focused on art as a tool for processing collective trauma. The exhibition featured work created by participants over the course of 6 months, each piece representing someone's journey toward healing and self-understanding. Sophie moved through the gallery with confidence I'd never seen before, discussing techniques and artistic choices with the authority of someone who truly understood both the creative process and the psychological mechanisms that made art therapeutic. She wasn't performing expertise she didn't possess, she was sharing knowledge she'd earned through her own study and experience. Art doesn't have to be beautiful to be valuable, I heard her explaining to a teenager who was looking skeptically at an abstract painting covered in dark, chaotic brushstrokes. Sometimes the most important art comes from our darkest feelings. This piece isn't trying to be pretty, it's trying to be honest. The teenager nodded thoughtfully, moving closer to examine the painting with new appreciation. I recognized something in Sophie's approach that reflected her own journey, the understanding that authenticity was more valuable than perfection, that truth-telling could be more powerful than people-pleasing. After the formal presentation ended, Sophie found me near the back of the gallery where I'd been observing from a distance. Her face was flushed with excitement and exhaustion, the particular combination that comes from doing work that feels genuinely meaningful. How did it go? I asked, though her expression had already answered the question. You seemed completely in your element up there. Sophie smiled, and it was the kind of unguarded, unself-conscious expression I remembered from our childhood, but had rarely seen in recent years. It felt amazing, she said. Scary and amazing, and right in a way that I didn't know work could feel right. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last few visitors examine the artwork that surrounded us. Each piece represented someone's courage to transform pain into something visible, to create beauty from experiences that had threatened to destroy them. In many ways, the entire exhibition was a testimony to the kind of healing Sophie was learning to facilitate professionally, and had been pursuing personally for months. Maya, Sophie said, her voice taking on the more serious tone that had become familiar since her accident. I need to thank you for reading my diary. The statement surprised me. I'd spent months feeling guilty about the violation of privacy, even though Sophie had forgiven me, and we'd both acknowledged that the revelation had been necessary for our healing. You don't need to thank me for that, I said. I shouldn't have, no, Sophie interrupted, shaking her head. I need to thank you because I don't think I ever would have found the courage to tell you all of that myself. I would have kept performing the role of the happy little sister who had everything under control, even though it was killing me. Finding out that you knew the truth forced me to stop pretending, and that's what I needed. The gratitude in her voice was genuine, but it was complicated by the recognition that our healing had required a crisis, that it had taken near tragedy to create the conditions for honesty in our relationship. I wondered how many families lived with similar misunderstandings, how many people carried struggles they felt unable to share, because the cost of being seen clearly felt too high. I think about that night sometimes, Sophie continued, referring to the accident without naming it directly. About what would have happened if I'd actually decided to take that California trip, if I'd had the courage to tell everyone that I needed space to figure things out instead of trying to make decisions based on what I thought everyone wanted from me. The thought was sobering. Sophie's accident had been traumatic and dangerous, had caused all of us tremendous fear and pain. But it had also created the circumstances that allowed our family to finally address problems that had been building for years. Without the crisis that forced us to examine our relationships more honestly, we might have continued living with the growing distance and misunderstanding that had been slowly eroding our connection. Do you think we would have figured it out eventually? I asked. If the accident hadn't happened, would we have found our way to this kind of honesty? Sophie considered the question seriously, her artistic mind perhaps visualizing alternative timelines and different outcomes. I don't know, she said finally. I think I was getting close to some kind of breaking point anyway. The pressure was becoming unsustainable, and I was starting to feel desperate enough to take risks, to make changes even if they disappointed people. But it might have taken much longer, and it might have been messier. We talked for another hour, standing in the gallery surrounded by visual evidence of other people's healing journeys. Sophie told me about specific moments in her recovery when she'd had to choose between honoring her own truth and managing other people's comfort. She talked about learning to tolerate disappointment, both her own disappointment in herself and the possibility that her choices might disappoint others. I shared my own process of learning to support her without trying to direct her path, how difficult it had been to resist offering advice and solutions when she was struggling with decisions about her future. We talked about the difference between love that empowers and love that controls, about how to maintain close relationships while still allowing each other the space to become whoever we were meant to be. As we prepared to leave the museum that evening, Sophie handed me a small wrapped package. "I made something for you," she said, her voice slightly shy in a way that reminded me of childhood birthday celebrations and homemade gifts that carried more meaning than anything store-bought could provide. Inside the package was a small painting on canvas, no larger than a sheet of paper but dense with color and meaning. It showed two figures walking side by side but not in lockstep, their paths parallel but not identical, their faces turned toward light that seemed to be coming from multiple directions rather than a single source. "It's us," Sophie explained, though the painting was abstract enough that the figures could have been anyone. "Learning how to walk together without walking in each other's shadows." The image captured something essential about the relationship we were building: connected but not codependent, supportive but not controlling, loving but not limiting. It represented the future we were working toward, where we could be honest about our struggles and celebrate our successes without either experience becoming a burden for the other person to carry. Months later, when Sophie graduated from her art therapy certification program and opened her own practice specializing in adolescent trauma recovery, I was there to celebrate with genuine pride that had nothing to do with how her choices reflected on our family. Her success looked different from mine, measured in different metrics and directed toward different goals, but it was authentically hers in a way that made it more meaningful than any conventional achievement could have been. The accident that had nearly taken Sophie from us had also given us the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than assumption, honesty rather than performance, love that empowered rather than love that constrained. We'd learned that healing was possible even after years of misunderstanding, that families could change and grow and become more honest with each other even when the process was difficult and uncertain. Sophie's diary, once a repository for secrets too painful to speak aloud, had become the catalyst for conversations that transformed our entire family's understanding of what it meant to truly support each other. The purple leather journal still sat on her desk, but now it was accompanied by new notebooks filled with observations about her work, sketches for art therapy exercises, and reflections on her own continued growth and healing. The sister I'd thought I knew had been a carefully constructed performance designed to protect everyone from the complexity of her actual experience. The sister I was learning to know was braver and more vulnerable, more honest and more challenging, more beautiful in her imperfection than she'd ever been in her compliance. And our relationship, rebuilt on the foundation of truth her diary had provided, was stronger and more authentic than anything we'd shared before. Standing in my own apartment that night, looking at the painting Sophie had given me, I realized that discovering her diary hadn't just revealed her secrets, it had revealed the possibility for a different kind of love, one that didn't require performance or perfection, but could embrace struggle and uncertainty as natural parts of the human experience. We'd learned to see each other clearly, and in that clarity had found the kind of connection that could survive anything because it was built on truth rather than illusion. The diary had been Sophie's way of preserving her authentic self when she felt unable to express it directly. But our family's willingness to listen to that truth, to sit with the discomfort it created, and to change in response to what we learned, had transformed a source of pain into a foundation for healing. Sophie's words, once written in isolation and secrecy, had become the beginning of conversations that none of us had known how to start, but all of us had desperately needed to have. Part 5. The new beginning. 2 years after the accident, I received a text from Sophie that made me smile in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Just got my first client referral from Dr. Williams. A 14-year-old who hasn't spoken since her foster placement. Want to celebrate with coffee later. The message was simple, but it represented something profound that had been building between us since that devastating and healing conversation in the hospital. Sophie was sharing good news with me not because she needed my approval or validation, but because she genuinely wanted to include me in her joy. There was no performance in her excitement, no careful editing to make her success sound more impressive or more secure than it actually was. I met her at Brew Haven, the coffee shop on Morrison Street that had become our unofficial meeting place for these kinds of conversations. Sophie had claimed the corner table by the window, her laptop open with what looked like treatment plans and intake forms scattered around her workspace. She'd grown into her professional identity in ways that still amazed me, developing a confidence that came from doing work that aligned with her deepest values and natural gifts. Tell me about her, I said, settling into the mismatched chair across from Sophie and genuinely wanting to hear the details of this new challenge she was taking on. Over the past 2 years, I'd learned to ask follow-up questions that invited Sophie to share more, rather than questions that sought to help, or fix, or offer advice. Sophie's face lit up with the particular kind of enthusiasm she reserved for discussing her work. She's been in the system for 3 years, bounced between 6 different placements. Her caseworker says she used to love drawing, but she stopped after the last transition. Dr. Williams thinks she might respond to art therapy because traditional talk therapy hasn't been effective. She pulled out a folder containing background information and preliminary assessment notes, sharing professional details with the careful attention to confidentiality that had become second nature in her work. Sophie had found her calling in helping children and adolescents who'd experienced trauma, and watching her discuss her cases was like witnessing someone speak their native language after years of struggling with awkward translations. The referral fee will finally let me afford that new set of art supplies I've been wanting, Sophie continued, and there was no shame in her voice about the financial realities of building a private practice in art therapy. She'd learned to talk openly about money as a practical consideration rather than a measure of worth, understanding that meaningful work didn't always translate to immediate financial stability, but trusting that her commitment to the field would eventually create sustainability. We spent an hour talking about her work, about the challenges and breakthroughs she was experiencing with her other clients, about the continuing education courses she was taking to deepen her expertise in trauma-informed care. Sophie had found a professional community that understood the value of what she was doing, colleagues who measured success in terms of client progress and healing rather than profit margins or conventional career advancement. But the conversation that mattered most that afternoon wasn't about her work at all. It was about the letter she'd received that morning from our cousin Rebecca, who was getting married in the fall and wanted Sophie to create a custom art piece for the wedding ceremony. The request was flattering and exciting, but it had also triggered some of the old anxiety about family expectations and the fear of disappointing people who mattered to her. She wants something that represents new beginnings and family connection, Sophie explained, her voice carrying a slight edge of worry that I'd learned to recognize. And I keep thinking about how everyone will be looking at this piece during the ceremony, how it needs to be perfect because it's representing something so important to Rebecca and David. 2 years ago, I would have immediately jumped in with reassurance and encouragement, telling Sophie that she was incredibly talented and that whatever she created would be beautiful. But I'd learned that my sister didn't need me to manage her anxiety for her. She needed me to listen to her concerns and trust her ability to work through them herself. What's the scary part? I asked instead, using the language Dr. Williams had taught our entire family for exploring difficult emotions without immediately trying to resolve them. Sophie considered the question seriously, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table surface in the absent-minded way she'd done since childhood when she was thinking deeply about something. I think I'm scared that if I create something that doesn't feel right to me, I'll do it anyway, because it's easier than disappointing Rebecca. And I'm scared that if I create something that does feel right to me, it might not be what she was hoping for. The distinction she was making revealed how much emotional intelligence Sophie had developed through her therapy and her work with clients who struggled with similar issues around authenticity and people-pleasing. She was learning to recognize the difference between healthy consideration for other people's needs and the unhealthy abandonment of her own creative instincts. Have you talked to Rebecca about what the piece means to her? I asked. Not just the practical details, but what she's hoping to feel when she looks at it. Sophie shook her head, already reaching for her phone. That's a good question. I've been so focused on trying to figure out what she wants that I haven't asked her about what she's actually hoping for. She paused, looking at me with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you for helping me think about this differently. The exchange was small, but it represented something significant about the relationship we'd built over the past 2 years. I was learning to offer support that empowered Sophie to find her own solutions rather than support that tried to solve her problems for her. She was learning to accept help that strengthened her own decision-making process rather than help that replaced her judgment with someone else's. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sophie mentioned something that caught me completely off guard. I've been thinking about writing a book, she said, her voice carrying the particular combination of excitement and uncertainty that accompanied her biggest dreams. About using art therapy with adolescents who've experienced family trauma. Dr. Williams thinks there's a real need for resources that help other therapists understand how to integrate creative approaches with traditional treatment methods. The idea was ambitious, and entirely Sophie's own, emerging from her professional expertise and personal passion, rather than from any external pressure or expectation. She was considering the project because she had something valuable to contribute to her field, not because she felt obligated to achieve something impressive or comparable to anyone else's accomplishments. That sounds incredible, I said, and meant it completely. Your insights about helping kids express trauma through art could really make a difference for other therapists and their clients. I paused, recognizing an opportunity to share my own vulnerability. I've actually been thinking about writing too, about marketing strategies for small nonprofits. Nothing as important as what you're considering, but something that might be useful to organizations that are doing good work on limited budgets. Sophie's face brightened with genuine interest, and she asked several thoughtful questions about my own potential project. The conversation was balanced in a way that our discussions about professional goals had never been before. We were both sharing dreams that felt meaningful to us personally, and we were both offering support that felt empowering rather than comparative. Walking back to our cars after coffee, Sophie stopped suddenly and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maya," she said, "I need to tell you something important." My stomach tightened with familiar worry, the old assumption that serious conversations would involve bad news or problems that needed immediate attention. But Sophie's tone wasn't distressed or urgent, it was clear and calm and deliberately thoughtful. "I'm grateful for the accident," she said, her words careful and considered. "Not grateful that I was hurt, not grateful that everyone was scared and worried. But grateful that it forced us to have conversations we never would have had otherwise. Grateful that it broke open something that needed to be broken so we could build something better." The admission was startling in its honesty, and I felt tears beginning to form as I understood what she was saying. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our family had also created the conditions for healing that might never have been possible under normal circumstances. Sophie's brush with death had given all of us permission to examine our relationships more honestly, to risk disappointing each other in service of being more authentic. "I'm grateful too," I said, reaching for her hand in the gesture that had become natural between us again. "Grateful that I finally learned how to really see you. Grateful that you found the courage to tell me the truth about how you'd been feeling. Grateful that we figured out how to love each other better." We stood there on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, two sisters who had found their way back to each other through honesty and crisis, and the difficult work of learning to support each other without trying to control each other's paths. The relationship we'd built over the past 2 years was stronger and more authentic than anything we'd shared before, precisely because it was based on truth rather than performance. Sophie's diary, once a repository for secrets too painful to speak aloud, had become the catalyst for transformation that none of us could have imagined. The purple leather journal that had revealed her struggles had also revealed our family's capacity for growth, for forgiveness, for love that could evolve and deepen when it was grounded in honest understanding of who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. That evening, I sat in my apartment looking at the painting Sophie had given me months earlier, the abstract representation of two figures walking parallel paths without casting shadows on each other. The image had become a reminder of what was possible when people committed to seeing each other clearly, to supporting each other's authentic journeys, rather than trying to reshape each other according to their own visions of success and happiness. Sophie's recovery had taught our entire family that healing was possible, even after years of misunderstanding, that relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of truth and mutual respect. Her courage in sharing her struggles had given all of us permission to be more honest about our own challenges and uncertainties. Her commitment to finding work that aligned with her values had shown us that success could be defined in terms of meaning and impact, rather than just financial security and social recognition. The sister who had once felt invisible had become someone who helped other invisible people find their voices through art and creativity. The family that had once communicated through performance and assumption had learned to practice honesty and curiosity in our daily interactions. The crisis that had threatened to take Sophie from us had ultimately given us the gift of truly knowing each other for the first time. Sophie's new beginning wasn't just about her recovery from the accident or her establishment of a successful art therapy practice. It was about the possibility of living authentically, of being seen and loved for who she actually was rather than who she thought she should be. And it was about our family's new beginning too, our commitment to supporting each other's real journeys, rather than our imagined versions of what those journeys should look like. The diary had been closed for months now, its secrets no longer secret, its pain transformed into understanding and connection. But the conversations it had started continued every day, in coffee shop meetings and family dinners and phone calls that created space for truth-telling and vulnerability. Sophie had found her voice, and in finding it, she had taught all of us how to listen better, how to love more authentically, how to build relationships that could withstand honesty and grow stronger because of it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.